Rebirth was my most anticipated game coming into this year, so I was both excited and nervous for it to come out. Everyone's been let down by a pre-order before. It's a terrible feeling.
I'm sad now.
My name's Joel, I make games for a living, and on today's GBU Reviews, we're talking about how awesome Rebirth is and how I have no regrets for buying it. And because it's the format of the show, I'll nitpick a few things I'm not in love with while trying to restrict myself to a theme. We'll be going over why Rebirth is already in line for my game of the year, undercutting elements in an established story, and how unfair it is to nitpick a story that's the middle child of a series. There's going to be some minor spoilers in this episode. You've been warned. I'll try and stay vague, but in order to talk about our topic, I have to say some stuff. You guys need to do your part too, though. No spoilers in the comments, unless it's funny. You know, wrong answers only type of things.
Hey, did you like the part where the shark fought the dinosaur?
All right, rules have been established. You've all been warned. Let's do this. Final Fantasy Rebirth does everything I wanted. The combat is fantastic. All the great things I said in the review of Part 1 are still true, and they've been improved. You can combo with your teammates at any time, and each character has gotten improvements. Aerith, for example, can teleport to her wards now, making her more elusive and making it so much easier to take advantage of her buffs. Multiple new upgrade systems and some new materia help build the characters according to your needs. Autocast was great in the first part of Remake, as it let the AI follow up your magic with their own spells. But that's been expanded. There's now auto-unique ability and auto-weapon skill materia. Each character is more fleshed out, and the voice actors nail it. They're putting other games to shame.
And that's how it's done!
Yuffie was never one of my favorites in the original, but her character and playstyle in Remake are god tier. Cait Sith, who I still don't use on my team because he's luck-based, surprised me with his voice and was genuinely entertaining as a character. And each character has excellent dialogue and quips as you explore the open world in more depth and in new methods than we've ever seen before.
Michael!
And it's not just the main gameplay that makes Rebirth worth playing. The devs went so far above and beyond, you can't go 5 minutes without a new minigame. There's Mario Kart, Gwent, Fall Guys, Rock Band, Tekken, Rocket League. That's not even half. But enough about how Rebirth's gameplay is basically perfect. Today's episode is supposed to be about the story. Rebirth has plenty of changes between itself and the original. Again, I'll try and be vague around spoilers. First off, the story helps with progression. Shinra actually pursues your group into Kalm, the first town you visit outside of Midgar, which I like because in the original they seem to give up the second you get off the road.
They didn't start chasing us until you turned on that getaway music!
The story changes are constantly pushing the party forward. Next, Rebirth helps bring in some of the extended universe lore into the game. Cisne, an ex-Turk first introduced in Crisis Core, makes an appearance in Gungaga. And while I wish they would have done more with her, I'm sure she'll show up in Part 3. Speaking of Gungaga, what was once an optional region of the original is now one of the most impactful to the story, filled with side quests. And lastly, because Rebirth is now part of a trilogy of games rather than just a singular standalone game, they get to set up new plot threads. As I played through the game, I was confused as to what was going on with Zack. Then more mysteries got added in as Aerith's materia loses its color. Some of the new elements are resolved by the end of the game, while others we're gonna have to wait for the third part of the trilogy to see how they play out. Final Fantasy Rebirth has the unlucky position of being the middle child of the trilogy, which means it doesn't really have a main antagonist. The first part of Final Fantasy VII Remake was able to lean on character introductions and using Sephiroth and the Arbiters of Fate as a means to not only introduce the world, but to explore the idea that the story wouldn't follow in the steps of the original. There are plenty of antagonists, Rufus Shinra, Hojo, the weapons, and of course Sephiroth all come to mind, but their story arcs are basically reserved for the third part of the trilogy. So Rebirth had to shuffle some key moments of the story around. And I don't mind this in theory. Part of the Medial plot has been moved to this game despite never visiting the location. The problem with shifting some scenes around is that it leads to undercutting significant moments from the original. I'm going to use something from the early parts of Rebirth so that we can stay mostly spoiler-free. In the original Final Fantasy VII, the party never encounters Sephiroth in Midgar. You can see his sword in President Shinra, and Cloud tells the party about Nibelheim where he builds up Sephiroth to be an all-powerful god, and we as players get glimpses of this power during Cloud's story where Sephiroth is a playable character. But the first true glimpse of Sephiroth's threat is the Midgard-Sarmer fight.
What did you say?
But in Remake, not only have we beaten Sephiroth to some capacity, the snake fight is a mandatory boss now. The game recreates the moment from the original by having Sephiroth toss it onto the tree in a cutscene, but we as players just won the fight. It's far less intimidating, and it doesn't make Sephiroth feel as ominous as he was in the original. And there's sadly a lot of examples like this in Rebirth. In an attempt to flesh out Wu-Tai and the war, there's a new character that interacts with Rufus, and it makes him feel like less of a corporate megalomaniac because he's no longer the mastermind of the war. I don't want to call him a pawn, but without giving away more details, that's the best way I can phrase it. The weapons have the same problem. Their new designs and how they're introduced makes them feel like less of a force of nature. Sid Highwind was one of my favorite characters in the original, but I'm not a fan this time around. It feels like they didn't have time for the Rocket Town plot, but wanted to force him in just so the whole cast could show up in Rebirth. But the worst offender is Cosmo Canyon. Bugenhagen went from being the wise mentor in the original to feeling like a cult leader. He dismisses the party's testimony of the weapons, and Barrett ends up feeling disheartened during the fire pit scene instead of being reinvigorated and declaring the rebirth of Avalanche. I don't know what it is about modern media ruining mentor characters, but this shit needs to stop. I basically stopped using Red 13 after this part of the story too. They changed his voice, which is stupid, but then they rushed through his story arc from the original. During Red's climactic moment, the game chooses to introduce a new character. So there's a problem with how some of the new elements play with the classic and memorable moments, and I wish the developers had spaced them out just so they weren't tripping over each other. I like a lot of the new story elements that Rebirth has brought to the story. I'm gonna spoil a pretty major one here. 3, 2, 1. In the original game, there's a brief mention of the Gi. They're the ones that attack Cosmo Canyon. In this game, their story gets expanded as the creators of the Black Materia. Great change because it takes two previously underdeveloped aspects of the world and links them together. The problem is, Guy Nakat as a character comes literally out of nowhere while Red is reuniting with Seto. Like, actually out of nowhere. He teleports in mid-scene.
Here comes the A-Train! Like, I tell you what, you get better and I'll teach you to run as fast as me.
Yeah?
Yeah?
You'll teach me to outrun cancer?
Every instance of undercutting would need its own unique fix. In this video, I'm going to focus on Guy Nakat so that we don't have to go into too much detail on other parts of the game. If I were part of the team, the first thing I'd do is try to introduce him to the story earlier. Similar to how Remake Part 1 introduced both Sephiroth and the Whispers by Chapter 2, it would give this chapter of the remake a more defined villain and build intrigue in players. And that's useful because veterans of the series know that the other antagonists like Rufus, Sephiroth, and the weapons won't be resolved during Rebirth. The way I'd go about this is by using the voices in Cloud's head. In the original, there's a voice that periodically talks to Cloud. In Remake Part 1, we only see Sephiroth, but that's not how I saw the voice in the original. It's never officially confirmed, but I've always thought of the voice as Zack. It's a popular theory, and in Advent Children we see Zack and Aerith, which makes me think that they had not fully returned to the planet, but were in some weird limbo, which is cool because in Rebirth there are segments where we get to play as Zack. Zack's inclusion was one of the biggest mysteries left over from the first part of the remake. If I were part of the team, I'd have used his chapters as a means to introduce Guy Nakat, who is himself trapped and unable to enter the lifestream. That way, we could periodically dive into both the Guy and Zack without having to make it feel like an exposition dump near the end of the game. We could pace out the information we want to grant players and use the bond between Zack and Cloud to relay the information back to the main story. This would have made Zack a more integral part of the story by weaving his narrative in more frequently. I feel like Zack was underutilized in Rebirth, or even distracted from the main plot. I don't want to spoil anything, and don't get the wrong idea, Zack is cool, but his role in the game is confusing and pointless for most of Rebirth's duration. It only really starts to matter near the end, which is a strange choice given that Zack is the first character you see when the game starts. Side characters should support the main story, but to me Zack detracts from the experience. Like how multiverses ruin Marvel by making sure no one gives a shit about the story because there's no stakes anymore. You can just reset in another universe.
You're not Cartman and multiple universes are stupid.
Oh, god damn it!
As much as I prefer my idea, I don't have full information. The Final Fantasy remake is a trilogy, so right now I'm judging without knowing how things will resolve. So here's hoping the third game shuts me up and proves that Square's version is better. For the first 30 hours of playing Rebirth, I honestly thought I wouldn't have anything to complain about. It delivered perfectly on so many aspects. By the end of it, there were some warning lights going off. The gameplay's great, but I'm starting to get some Game of Thrones vibes, where the first few seasons were amazing, but by the end of it, I'm watching every scene going,
well then get your shit together! Get it all together and put it in a backpack! All your shit, so it's together!
I'm a little worried for the finale, but that's only because I love the original. This game would be better if I had nothing to compare it to. But since I've seen scenes like the Promise in Nibelheim in the original, some of Rebirth's moments fell flat because their execution wasn't as good. Tifa on the water tower is my phone's background. I'm hoping Square doesn't turn Final Fantasy VII into another Kingdom Hearts where the third game is so stupidly complex no one understands the story even with a PhD.
In Kingdom Hearts, this is when Sora goes into Hollow Bastion so he can fight Riku, who's actually being possessed by Ansem, who is the heartless version of Terra Xehanort, who was originally Terra but then was possessed by Xehanort before him.
But there's still so many iconic scenes I'm waiting to see recreated in the third part of the remake. The gameplay of the first two parts has been perfect, and even though there's some warning flags, I have to see how everything resolves. So I'll be there on day one to play the next part of the trilogy.